Oh, we're back and we're moving on to Chapter 3. Our topic in Chapter 3 will be views, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of a disclaimer up front, the way that this book is put together. This particular chapter does not have some of the step-by-step exercises like the previous ones, and therefore the assignment related to any step-by-step instructions within the chapter are being treated as extra credit. What I do ask you to do for homework in this chapter as alternative is to both reflect upon the contents of the chapter to make sure that you understood it, and additionally do a little bit of research and find a couple of online resources that might help to deepen your understanding of views within MVC and .NET. All right, without further ado, let's jump back over to the book, which of course is way over here. So here it is. And let me get to the top of Chapter 3 here. This is not the fast way to do it, but here we go. All right, so here we are in Chapter 3, and the topic, of course, is views. And this is the one piece that's kind of interesting that I'm hoping you guys start to piece together with traditional ASP.NET, and then see one real significant thing that's happened, most notably what we call the Razor View Engine, and what that brings to the mix in terms of how we author content and output for views. All right, so these are the topics for the chapter. Thank you for letting me know. I will make sure that I am. I will broadcast my screen just a moment here. All right, so one thing I always want to remind you of, you guys, is right here, the author often will point out that you can go to the website and pull down the source code examples for this chapter, and I encourage you to do that. I'm not going to do that for this particular little lecture piece I'm about to do. All right. So as we learn more and more about this architecture of MVC, we learn how the view is the component that the user interacts with, right? Both to initiate something happening and then to see the results of something happening. Now that view, of course, ultimately comes to a browser, and therefore the ultimate authoring code for that really is HTML, because that's really what a browser reads. The technologies that we're using are similar to some older technologies, but they are not like the ASP.NET web forms or PHP, as the author indicates, that you've learned about in the past, where you're doing traditional server-side scripting, which then generates your HTML for you. I mean, yes, there is HTML generation, but some things are pre-created and then stitched back together rather than just writing the code. And you'll see what I mean as I go. As I said, one of the more impressive new tools in this architecture is this whole Razor View Engine, and when you see that in action, you're going to see what a benefit it brings to creating content for output. All right, so if we start to look at some of the content that we have in our application, what the author does is he takes the contents from the index CS.HTML page and puts it up on the screen for us. And I want you to notice right at the top of the page, in fact, if you look at this code on your screen, you'll see it with the color coding, which I think can be helpful. But notice, you know, once you get past these first couple lines, it looks like standard HTML. And yes, your MVC applications can contain an ample amount of standard HTML. Absolutely. Why not, right? It's a technology we know and it works well. And if you're working with static content that doesn't change, why would you use something else? However, at the top here, notice that we have this, you know, special little @ sign followed by a set of curly braces, and then inside here, what looks to be some sort of plain text being attached to this thing we call a view bag. And a view bag is something that you can think of as a container to store content prior to being rendered on the screen. And you can probably, just from your experiences, make an educated guess here and realize that viewbag.title, where it says homepage, that's going to be, what would you think that's going to be? Where do you think that content would end up on the screen? Any guesses? Right up at the top? Actually, it sets the title bar that you see here, right up here. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't, put on the homepage, but it does put it in the title, which is the HTML construct. So there is some syntax there that should be somewhat familiar. So we are creating the page title. It puts it in the tab where the title is typically stored, viewed by the user. All right. Now, they would show you that if you browse to the site what it would look like, but it shows you where it affects it. Now, let's extend that same concept to an actual action method. In this case, we're going to throw it in the home controller in the About section. And if you wanted, you could actually tweak your application to show this and play with it. That's up to you if you want to try it. But notice now that instead of creating a string, right, like we did before, we're changing the method back to an action method. So we're using one of the action keywords. We're saying action result for the About method. Then we will generate a view bag that will store the contents, and we're storing it as a message. It's kind of interesting, right? So you can see why they were picking certain words when you're doing the strings. And of course, it's just plain text. And then we return the view, which contains that message. So we're not returning message per se, but the message is part of what's going back. I hope that makes some sense. So if you go ahead and run that in your browser, you would get this coming back up onto the screen. Let's jump over to the About CS HTML page. And there, once again, we have a view bag title at the top. We know what that does. That's going to put About in the title of the tab so the user can see it. And then notice, inside of HTML tags, we can also insert these little directives. So I can put a view bag preceded by an @ sign inside an H2, inside of an H3, in fact, inside any HTML construct. The output of that will look like this. So the view bag title About, that ends up here. Notice that the view bag title, which has been set up here, can be reused and then stuck into an H2, which apparently is this, right? Because it's the same as About. And then the message, which we put together, is coming through in the H3 and is indicated right here. And the point of these examples is to show you the correlation between some of the items that are being created and then how they end up on the screen. Now, the one thing that they have you do in this chapter is they want you to explore your Solution Explorer. And then I want you to notice how certain things that we will put up on the screen in the Views folder will correspond, in many cases, to the controllers that we create to direct the traffic and make actions happen. But the Views is really the part that controls the output to the screen. That is where we have our output code. You should get familiar with that. Now, really interesting thing is, remember I told you that just because you hit an index method does not necessarily mean that you are going to go to Yeah, you're not going to necessarily go home or to an index page. In fact, what you can do, as you see in the second result here, is in this case, they actually push a different URL to you. So you can basically redirect the user dynamically by going to a certain page. So hitting the index method doesn't necessarily take you to an index page. It can take you wherever you want to take them. This next little section talks about what we call strongly typed views. Now, the simple things that we've done so far really work pretty well with simple content. Little snippets of text, little pieces of HTML, kind of reusing certain little bits of data. But as the author indicates, that if you're working with like a robust set of data, let's say you're pulling in tables from a database, then you will start to run into problems with these tools. And what will happen is you'll need to find a different method. And really what they're trying to demonstrate for you guys is why they came up with using the Razor View engine to replace some of these things, and how you might want to do some different approaches to make things a little bit clearer. Notice, for example, this little snippet of code. This is just some straight up C# code, right? So you see your curly brackets, you got your semicolons, and you see that we create like a variable for albums. We put inside a list array, and then we run a loop, and then we go through, and it looks like we're adding new albums with titles and whatever. And then ultimately, we try to feed all that into the view bag and send it back to the screen. So really the intent there is to gather the information from a data source, run it through a loop to pull back all the rows of the table, store it in the view bag, and then output the view bag. Okay? Pretty simplistic, really. But watch what happens when we switch to a little bit different approach, and notice the @ sign at the beginning and how this approach differs a little bit. So this one, we just say for each, we want to output that to the screen. We have to have a structure to put it into. We're still pulling from the view bag. What are we doing? We're feeding it into an unordered list, and yes, this would actually repetitively run and make it happen. The weird thing about that, though, which they point out, is that you end up really casting to an IEnumerable list structure, which kind of adds a level of complication to the mix. And one thing that they have here, if you notice, is you've lost the benefit of Intellisense when accessing the properties of the album. So even though you can pull back the list, you're not really able to dynamically, through Intellisense, pull back the subcontents. So that, for me, is kind of an interesting thing. Notice that they change it up here a little bit, and notice the little keyword dynamic, and that's the one that allows you to automatically kind of adjust that content coming in and adjust it to a different format. Now, if you ramp this up to another level here, really we're working with data structures, and this is kind of like where they're pulling us one step at a time. We are working with data structures, but we're not necessarily really treating it as the data structure that it is. So what you're seeing in this particular example, notice that we're doing an action result where we're going to list the albums. Once again, we set up a list, we run the loop, we populate the list, and then we turn the view, which is albums. But notice the next one down, and notice what is bolded. A model, right? And this isn't what the chapter's about, but a model is the representation of the data, and what happens is that model allows us to deal with the data as an object in a more effective manner than dealing with it like traversing through a list with a loop, right? Because then we can deal with that whole thing as one object, and that's pretty powerful. Remember, the focus here is not on models right now. We will be talking about that. But what happens is the output mechanism that returns it now is simplified even further because of the structure that it's being stored into. Don't worry about memorizing this. I'm not quizzing you on this stuff. All right? Nor do I expect you to code this from scratch. All right? And you'll see why as we progress here. All right. So often what we do when we're building the data that we're working with, we'll often structure those models together as an object, and then instead of specifying it in one long string every time we need it, we can actually pull in our own using statement and take our model and pull it directly into the application. So once we've done it once, there's no reason to do it again. See the logic there? We just pull it in, and yes, we are intermingling it with our HTML. Kind of, yes, it is kind of, that's not a bad way to think of it, using it kind of like a library that you created. You're just taking the data that you have, you're storing it into an object that you pull into your code, rather than going to the data store each time and traversing all the data. It's already in this object, so you don't have to retraverse it. That's a good way to think of it. I like that thinking. All right. Now, one of the things that happens, though, is you increasingly find better ways to do it. So what they're indicating here is that ultimately you can actually treat that object that you created as a namespace and name it. And that way, once again, you're simplifying the syntax or the call to that data. All right. And what they show here, and this is the thing that I indicate in the extra credit assignment, is this little bit. If you want to play with the actual music store application, you can actually pull it in from the package manager directly, and this is one that you would do from a console. You can also use NuGet to pull it in. So in other words, you can pull in that whole structure and look at it as if you want. Now, I have this as an extra credit assignment. I don't consider it critical for your understanding, but if you have the time to do it and it's not that hard for you, go ahead and make it happen. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at these other view structures here real quick. One being ViewBag, ViewData, and ViewData Dictionary. We've already been dealing with ViewBag quite a bit. And what you've discovered is, like, before you put stuff on the screen, what you do, and you can think of it as a paper bag if you want. Like, you want to take the stuff and put it on the screen. Before you put it on the screen, you cram it all in the bag, and then when it's time to show it on the screen, you just empty out the bag, and there it is, right? So you can kind of gather the stuff up in the bag. Now, ViewData is a little bit different in that it is intended for using data that pre-exists outside of something that you've created. They give an example here of ViewData, and notice how, the approach here, the syntax, versus ViewBag, which uses this approach. Now, I'm going to tell you, functionally, this is a simple example, so what's really the advantage? It's just a matter of syntax in this case, right? But there is a little bit of a difference to which is actually more powerful. So he goes through a little diatribe here about what might be better and why. And some of it, frankly, it comes down to, it kind of depends on what kind of data you're passing. Notice that with ViewData, I can actually pass in content with spaces. And in a ViewBag, you can't do it in exactly that same way. You have to actually assign it to a variable first. The other thing that is kind of fascinating is how it works actually with the HTML constructs. So one thing that you'll find is it will be situationally dependent. Now, granted, the stuff that we're going to do in this class, you're not going to be confronted with like some coding situation where you're going to have to try to figure your way out of it. Everything's going to be provided for you. But typically speaking, it is dependent upon the circumstance. And the circumstance always dictates the solution that you take in solving a programming problem. The other one that they talk about, the View Data Dictionary, is just a special tool that allows you to pull information about various different components that you're working with in terms of the data. So like if you're defining what that data is, it allows you to strongly type to it very easily. Next little section here is about view models. So sometimes when you are working with data that's being pulled up from a model, things don't always line up very cleanly. So what you end up doing is creating interfaces that allow you to pull that data in more selectively. So in this case, what they're doing is they're taking the content of all the listing of the albums and they're putting it into what we call like drop-down lists. So if I wanted to, let's say, choose jazz, right? I'd hit the list, it would read in from the data, populate the list for me, and then I can select it dynamically from that list automatically. Well, you do have to pre-create the structure for the data and give it data. Obviously, I mean, it's not going to come from thin air. But once you do that, you don't have to have it memorized in your code in order to pull down the list. You don't have to say, give me jazz, rock, fusion, whatever. You just give me the genres. Right, and it just pulls that funky genre down for you. That's right. All right. What is really fascinating about this, and we're building our way towards this, what you're going to see here is when we do start to feed data to our applications, sometimes we just imply the structure of the data, and then it builds the data for us. This is what we call a code-first approach. We will talk more about this. But you notice it can be just about anything. It can be strings or numbers or lists or arrays or whatever data structure you can imagine. And notice that when we add those, we are basically creating private data fields for a class. And notice if we want to have getters and setters for a particular object, this is how we do it in C#. We just say get, set, done. You don't have to go through like this complicated declaration. That's one thing I do like about C#. So you don't have to like formally define your getters and setters like you do in Java, for example. Right? Even though Java does have tools that make it automatic, the simplified syntax is a wonderful thing. Now, what's fascinating about this example that they see here, so this snippet of code and the second one, is the fact that you can define your data model, and once it's defined, then you can pull it in this fashion. Notice we're not feeding it any particular data at this point, because often what you do is you just create the structure and then have the application give you an interface to feed the data in. Or you create the structure and then maybe have a separate file that reads the data in. Or maybe you just connect to a database. But what is cool about MVC is this code-first approach where we can define the structure very easily. The application is intelligent and then automatically builds the structures that we're implying from our code. So what that would do is it would build a table that allows for an IEnumerable list, a number, decimal, and a string, and puts them basically into a structure like a database table, if you want to think of it that way, that we can pump content into. Very cool. Once again, they show you these examples, so you could run this install here in NuGet and pull that content down for examination. All right. So if we get to the point of adding a view, kind of like we added a controller, you will go to that views folder, give it a right click, and generate one. Or, better yet, and this, I love this about this technology, if I have a controller, like we just added some stuff that doesn't appear in the menu of the application, right? We did like store, and we did browse, and we did details, remember? We did those things. And if I want to create a view for one of those components, instead of going to the view folder and creating a new view, I can actually locate, for example, the method inside the controller, right-click directly on the method, and notice on the right-click what it says? Add a view for it. And by doing that, it builds out a view associated to that method. What's it doing? It's building us a page, and we're not coding it. How cool is that? That is cool. And it's cooler when you see it in action. All right. You will be asked a couple of questions, of course, when you do that, and you'll get a little box that looks like this. And then sometimes you just create an empty view. So you're really kind of creating a page. It might have a title, but it doesn't really have any stuff in it. Then it's up to you to put the stuff in, clearly. But notice that there's a couple of little boxes here that you can choose from. And if you're building it and you're building it empty, that's the one where you add your own content. However, if I have an implied data structure, I can attach to that model and pull in the structure to the page, and it will feed that content into my page. And if I ask it to, also build all the tools required to do complete CRUD operations, complete database interactions automatically. That's the thing called scaffolding, another thing we're going to look at. Our focus right now really is on the view. So for example, here they're showing empty without a model, but you could also put in the ability to create or delete or details or edit or all these other options that go with. All right. So Tom. And folks, I just had one of my students remind me of the fact that we are past ending time for the class here. But I want to end it with this. The one thing that you will notice in that interface that we're working with, that's called the scaffolding interface, are some of the things that we can do. And this little table here explains in detail what each one of those options allows us to do. When we come back next time, we'll start by finishing this little lecture component, and then we'll move on to our next set of exercises. This chapter does not really have formal exercises attached to it. It's an extra credit. So if you do like the install the NuGet packages and play with it a little bit, you can earn a little bit of extra credit there. So I encourage you if you want to do that. Otherwise, the assignment for Chapter 3 related to this book is to reflect on what you've learned in the chapter and then also go out online and research a couple of sources for finding out more and share those with me. It's a small point value assignment, but that's the work for Chapter 3. All right, folks, we'll see you next time.